I have facts.
People don't show up here to listen to your opinion. Oh, sorry. I think it's time.
Okay, and we're live. So, hi everyone. Welcome to our current issue of Glasshouse. We were away for a couple of weeks, and we've started a new season. We have a guest. I'll get to that in a minute. But well, actually, no. Let's do that. So, we've got Silas, who decided to show up, Jags, Tanji, and Pablo, and myself, and our special guest, Matt Armstrong, also known as Mountain Runner on Twitter. He is apparently a lot into fitness stuff, so we're looking forward to finding out about that, particularly the trails around his area. A lot of good posts on that, so stick around. In terms of things that have happened, I guess outside of the physical world where a whole bunch of shit actually happened, basically the biggest cyber stuff was Optus got hacked. There was a leak threatened. Then ASD was like, hey, we'll get it back. Then the guy was like, oh my God, no, no copyright intended, for informational purposes only. And he vanished. So that was a cyber thing. And then the Uber hacker got caught and turns out to be a 17-year-old. So I think, that probably comes as a complete and total shock. My comment on that earlier was these sorts of hacks have to be done by teenagers because only teenagers have such a poor understanding of risk that they do that. It's not a skill thing, it's just no one else is that dumb. Okay, so Matt Armstrong, as well as being into fitness and biking, also dabbles a little bit in the disinformation space. So what I would love to hear from him is about the USIA and why it is not the solution to propaganda.
That's my cue. Hey, thanks for having me on here. I don't know about the fitness part. I'm 30 pounds, nearly over my race weight, and 20 pounds over what I'd like to be. So I think it's all relative.
And you're still the fittest person on this stream by a mile.
So I guess just jumping in the deep end. Restate the question. Why is USIA not the right thing?
Yeah, no, so here we go. I believe that the problem is that the US was unable to counter Russian propaganda in 2016 because they disbanded USIA. Why am I wrong?
Okay. Well, the first and easy part is that USIA didn't deal with domestic information operations, first and foremost. So you were probably, in your thinking about Russian information operations, you're probably not thinking about foreign countries, whether it's France or somewhere in Africa or somewhere in Asia or whatever, somewhere in Europe, right? So that's your first problem. The second is that USIA was really not focused on disinformation. It really did not do political warfare. I can give a bunch of examples, but my favorite and shortest one is you've heard of the Active Measures Working Group. And if the Active Measures Working Group, which was established under the Reagan administration, was, it was necessary to counter Russian disinformation because USIA did not have that job. In fact, the one guy that was really tasked with that job and then later went to the State Department is still around, Todd Leventhal. So it was a very minor project. So if you look at, there's this one history on the Active Measures Working Group published by NDU Press. And it says there was a realization in the early 70s, maybe late 60s, I forget now, nobody's job was countering disinformation. And so you had this USIA agency who was really a public affairs agency in the neutral term, in the main. It did do some aggressive information operations activities. And in fact, there's this one case when the JFK Special Warfare Center reached out to me because they had a kid of a then deceased PSYOPer who said, "I've got the shadow box of medals, and I want to make the shadow box of medals from my dad, but there's this one from USIA." and USIA had given him a commendation. And the Special Warfare Center is like, what is this? The PSYOP battalion is like, what the heck is this? And what I found was that in Operation Power Pack, which was in Honduras or Guatemala, I'm hoping it's one of those two, not a third country, but in one of those countries, USIA actually, a USIA assistant director actually took, or associate director, actually took operational control over a PSYOP battalion in this activity. So there are these exceptions, but they generally prove the rule because one, nobody knows about that because that was just a thing off on the side. The main of it, because at about the same time you had the assistant secretary, an assistant USIA director, co-author a report on what needs to change with USIA. This is, we're talking the mid 60s. USIA needs to influence, not just inform. So this is a whole bunch of reasons why what you think USIA was, it was not. And there's another part of this. Go ahead.
Sorry, is part of that because now that it's not around, it's very easy to sort of mythologize what it could have done. Like,
Yes,
oh,
I think
of
so.
course we weren't able to do whatever. It's because we got rid of like this great thing that used to exist.
We had a thing called information agency. Ergo,
Right.
we did information. But there's another part to the what I call the USIA genre, or the bring back USIA genre, is that they imagined that the strength of USIA was its headquarters, that it was deeply integrated with the formulation and execution of foreign policy in DC. The reality is, its real strength was its ground game, its people out in the field. That's where it really excelled. And when you
Right.
when you read about the examples, that's what you're talking about. But none of the bring back USIA talks about the field. They just want to recreate headquarters.
Yeah, like none of them want to be stationed in the field. They all want fucking cushy jobs in DC. That's the point of bringing it back, I assume. But
Well, if the analysts or the pundits that are saying bring back USIA, yeah, they don't want to be driving that Jeep with the projector mounted on the back going into the terrible places, which is what the USIA officers did.
right, but it seems to me like that is actually an important point. Is that the value of that sort of agency is the operational stuff that they do, not their closeness to formulation of policy of any sort. I mean,
Right. So
maybe about
Edward R. Murrow touched on this.
Yeah.
Edward R. Murrow touched on this with his famous quote in the public diplomacy realm of the last 3 feet. The last 3 feet is important. But what's lost in that larger quote is that he was saying, what he said was transmitting, I'm going to paraphrase because it's more interesting that way, hurling information 10,000 miles through radio is the easy thing. Engaging in the last 3 feet is where it really matters. And is that it's not just the actual face-to-face, but it is that engagement through whatever means of this direct engagement that matters, the ground game, not the hurling from DC stuff.
Right. So there's some really funny stuff with that, where there is a British report on black propaganda stations that they were running against the Middle East. And they sent out this like opinion pamphlet to all of their embassies to say, like, after listening to our thing, what is the word on the street for our stuff? Like, how's it influencing people? And there are things that came back where like Egypt was like, no one has radios. Like, like we can't reach it. I've never heard of it. People don't even have radio. It's not a thing. And like in Saudi Arabia, it's similar. It's like no one's ever mentioned it. Like we don't have electricity. That's not a thing. Like, so like clearly when it was put together, like this was a really clever idea. But then, like these minor operational details, like you're sending a radio message to people who don't have radios, like that hadn't quite gotten through. But
well, I think I think it depends, because I would say that because the field was empowered, unlike in a way that we don't realize today, that there was better on the ground awareness. But to your point, when Russia invaded Ukraine the second time, there was this discussion of, hey, let's reignite shortwave. Okay, that's really cool. And I got into these discussions. And when I was a governor on the Broadcasting Board of Governors, I did a deep dive into BBG, now the U.S. Agency for Global Media, use of shortwave, and was it still a useful tool? And for places like Russia and China, yeah, shortwave is still used, but there's a couple of things to know is that the audiences that matter aren't using shortwave. What you're talking about, for example, in Russia, are those farmers thousands of miles away from Moscow who may or may not care to listen. And even if they do, and even if you get their minds and get them to change their will to act in a certain way, they're not going to do anything. And there's the same situation with China, is that, yeah, you're going to have that dissident in a jail close to the Mongolian border, or you're going to have an entire village, but they don't matter. The audiences that matter in both those countries have long ditched shortwave, and they don't care. So you'd be hurling, or let's do satellite TV. Well, you know what, in the Middle East, you can blanket an area with satellite TV because it used to be, and I'm out of date with this, and maybe it's changed, is that in many parts of the Middle East, people would use satellite like we did in the 1980s. In the 70s, where you point your satellite in a direction and then you grab everything off that satellite. But Russia, for example, they use satellite like we do, which is like DirecTV. I pay for a subscription service, and if it's not in that, I don't get it. So all of a sudden you're just blanketing the same idea. So I would say that, yeah, you've got these problems, but in a way, I think the USIA structure didn't necessarily have that problem because it had much better control. The USIA director had better control, far more control over the public affairs sections out in the field and the libraries and the engagement programs. So you did have that centrality. But again, the Bring Back USIA genre doesn't mention that. And that's not their focus. Their focus is, I want a headquarters unit. And USIA was outside of this process, which is the 1945 article that Chris Paul and I wrote that we focus on, that USIA was actually an example of failure. It was the product of segregating information, fully separating information away from the policy process. Which is funny in a way, because the promise of creating USIA was that, okay, it must be integrated if we're going to do this. Oh, yeah. But of course, no, it didn't happen. And that's why even 4 years after it was created, you start seeing report after report after report. This isn't working. We need to reintegrate this with foreign policy, and over. And then as part of this, you start to see you see the emergence of the term, or the adoption of the term, public diplomacy as part of a public relations game, to argue this agency is relevant as an independent entity and it must stay independent. And
that makes sense for like Voice of America, where you want to have a neutral third party providing a sort of baseline of news information. Like VOA, it makes sense. You don't want that deeply integrated into policy, because that's going to undermine the credibility of that station. But anything outside of that, like, I think as an example, just to like make it more concrete, is it's very hard to get people to believe something when you're doing the exact opposite, right? So like, if you keep putting out stuff of like, we're your friends, while at the same time like blowing up people's villages, they're not going to believe you very much. Like, you can't really overcome like the deeds that you're doing. And like that's sort of some of the stuff that was happening in Vietnam, where there was a lot of the like, we're doing hearts and minds, but also like, this is a free fire zone. And like, they should appreciate that we're doing this to protect them, even if we sometimes kill their cows or their relatives, or, blow up their stuff. And, again, it's you can't convince people you're friendly by shooting at them.
Yeah, so this gets into a couple of things. One is the PhD I'm working on. If you look at, which is the U.S. political, or U.S. responses to Russian political warfare in the early part of the Cold War. And if you look at, for example, Truman's speech for announcing the Truman Doctrine, it is very principled. And if you look at then Secretary of State George Marshall, not then, it's the Truman speech, but before that, Marshall was going to the Hill saying we need an information program because we need our policies to be known. right? So the point of, if you look at the Truman speech, and if you look at what Marshall was saying, why we need an information program, and he was arguing for the passage of what we now know as the Smith-Mundt Act, which was really one of the first legislative responses to Russian political warfare. And it was an engagement in this broad information space through a vast variety of means. It was because our policies needed to be known and transparent, and it needed an information program, and they worked hand in hand. And you fast forward, and for example, in most of this century, in the examples you refer to, we wanted public diplomacy to put lipstick on the pig, to change the subject, and that's very different. And so there is a challenge that's inherent in that. But I want to go back to VOA, is that a fun thing that's in a book I'm writing is that, which is on the history of the Smith-Mundt Act, is that it was the intent that the radio broadcasting service inherited from the Office of War Information, which was not called Voice of America when it was at OWI. The intent was, months after it went to state, to spin it out into a private entity, because there was concern that having it under the foreign ministry would sterilize it too much. And in fact, that was a complaint at the beginning. And something that people forget is that the programs VOA was doing at that time, it would be 15 minutes a day to this country, maybe an hour to that country. It wasn't a 8-hour day, 12-hour day, 24-hour day, because shortwave was a very expensive technology. Anyway, so we didn't ultimately do that, which I think is interesting, because just as a side note, because you guys are interested in this, if VOA had been spun out to this private entity, the idea was a board of trustees would oversee it, and these were appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate, and be bipartisan. Would the CIA had needed to establish Radio Free Europe, or would they have maybe gone to Voice of America under this International Broadcasting Foundation? And I don't know. This is it's an interesting question. But
I mean,
fast
particularly
forward
at
to
that
today.
time, yeah. So
The beauty of something like VOA, and this is, I think, where also people don't understand, is that it is not just a CNN or a Fox or whatever it is. It is engaging those specific discrete audiences in those places that lack access to information, either because of lack of capacity. Indonesia is a great example. There's no censorship, but there's really no professional media there that's really any good, but they want it. Or full-on censorship, Russia, China, or a great deal of suppression, lots of places in Africa. And so the idea there is, it's not just translation, but it's actually knowing, and this goes to an earlier question, an earlier point, knowing who the audience is, what do they know, and what do we need to provide them. So it's actually local news, if you want to think of it that way. It's surrogate news service. So it's translating what's going on in the US, the region, the world, in that country, depending. Or VOA is not as much local, but sometimes it is. And it's, people are often local celebrities, because they're not just parachuting in, they're actually from there. But they get to translate.
I know a bunch of journalists who work for like the VOA Asia branch, like over here, because this is the, like, Bangkok is basically where you get based for Southeast Asia. And so, yeah, like at the like Foreign Correspondents Club or whatever, like that's where they are. And yeah, it's very,
and they're
much
risking their
local
lives.
news.
They're not just parachuting, they're from there. But there's also this other part that I think gets lost in this information stuff, is that knowing your audience is really important. For example, remember the Detroit bankruptcy, when the city went bankrupt. So VOA Russia service took that story and ran with it. Why? What's interesting about that? That makes us look bad. No, actually, it's showing accountability, because you don't have to talk about Russia. You don't have to talk about the corrupt leaders at St. Petersburg's corrupt mayor and whatever officials that come out of St. Petersburg. You show that here's what happens when the mayor is corrupt, when there's all these problems at the city, and they connect the dots, right? These things can be very subtle. And so, but the uniqueness of this tool is often lost, because people look at it as a blunt instrument. But it also provides a conduit that the State Department has really rarely used, because it is Voice of America. The VOA reporters can easily go in, interview the president, the secretary of state, civil leaders. In fact, this was the idea of this government radio, was that news services would condense what the president actually said. And I actually have analyses where the State Department said, like, this service said this much and this much, but it was actually this much, so we want VOA to put out this much. This is actually what was said. You don't need to do comment. This is actually what was said, because again, it was about transparency. We want you to know what actually happened. So you have these tools, but people aren't really utilizing it, and they misconceive it.
Hey, Matt, you brought up some excellent points and some key terminology. And I think one of the things that I wanted to draw out, from everybody here is some flavor of nerd, and in a U.S. government context anyway, that falls under this sort of umbrella called CNO, as they try to frame this, which is a subset of this thing called information warfare, which is where my background was. But I know that you do not like the term information warfare. You use political warfare. Let's take a step back and how should we be thinking about this, and what terms should we be using as opposed to going on for the past few years? What is the framework or lens that we should be looking at this stuff with from a scholar and an expert on this, as opposed to the political shenanigans that people won't play with this stuff?
Yeah, so it's a good question, and my preference is political warfare because the emphasis is on the effect, the desired end state. And it is much more inclusive, right? For example, as I testified not too long ago, gray zone, the problem with gray zone is that it defines where it happens between war and peace. Well, you know what? Peace is where we should be doing most of our fighting, so we don't have to do it later on. And we take it for granted for so much. In fact, so many institutions, I love how, like, for example, UNESCO. We supported UNESCO, the development and establishment of UNESCO, as an alternative, as a complement to US, what we would call public diplomacy, but let's call it information operations. And in fact, if you look at the UNESCO Charter, wars begin in the minds of men. So in the minds of men, the defenses of peace must be established, or something like that. That was put in there. Those are the words of a British Prime Minister, Attlee, but those words were put there by the inaugural Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs, Assistant Secretary of State, Archibald MacLeish. And it was very intentional. In fact, there were some conversations in Congress that, hey, we've got UNESCO. Why do we need to fund the State Department operation? So, but we think about UNESCO. We don't think of UNESCO as this type of information operations entity, right? And it's only an information operations entity for those people that want to suppress access and freedom and all that sort of stuff, right? So, ultimately, I think it's about political warfare. Gray zone is a defined space, and it's inadequate. Information, the problem with that is that information is a munition. And it's because definitions matter. We get so focused on information being nouns, verbs, pictures, and it can be activities. And so it can be all sorts of different things. But when we say information, we're not looking at the societal aspects, the economic aspects, the military or combat aspects, any of these other things. So I think that term generally becomes self-limiting. Hybrid warfare, I think, is the military's angle to try to stake out a peace, because it's a combination of combat and non-combat. So, in my PhD, I'm looking at these terms, and there are people, I've got this sitting right here, that are looking at other terms at the time. Political communication, for example. War, psychological war, because it's all about the effect, what you're attempting to achieve, not the munition. But the word warfare, of course, people have problems with. In fact, the United States Information Service, which predates USIA, so the Smith-Mundt Act was to authorize the continuation and expansion of the United States Information Service. So this operated during World War II. It was reestablished in the 30s after it was first established by the Committee for Public Information, its foreign section in 1917. So the initial idea for Congress of USIS was, and the Smith-Mundt Act, was to make this information service a ready instrument of psychological warfare. That language was stripped from that was a draft report, code from a Codel. That was stripped from the final public version. Not surprised, State Department probably said, I don't like the word warfare, which is understandable, but that's what I would go with, because I think it helps focus us on the intended effects, and it broadens the aperture of where are the activities going to be coming from.
So Matt, let me go back on a second on that, because we spent a lot of time talking about what we in the military used to call target system analysis, right? Know your audience, right? Know the channels they use for communication, know what they care about so you can select the right content. Mm-hmm. What we haven't really talked about directly is how to do the defense. One of the things that has changed is really the method of communication and who has access to it, right? So, up until social media, you really needed to be kind of a nation state to have access to large enough transmitter to be able to get an FCC license so you could transmit your message. Now that's no longer needed, right? Katy Perry has, 50 times the number of followers as the Prime Minister of Britain, right? And she can say whatever the hell she wants. Along with that, Americans are known for a couple of things, not all of them great, but one of the things that we're known for is we love being Americans, but we have a healthy distrust of our government. And we have a visceral reaction every time we talk about our government and influencing internally, right? Department of State isn't really chartered for doing internal things. The intelligence community isn't really chartered for doing things internally. And DOD is prohibited by doing so by executive order. So you suggested that this kind of larger information effort in whatever shape should be under Department of State. I agree that it should have some part in public diplomacy, but I don't think Department of State is the right place for that. So where should it be? How do we do internal defense against foreign disinformation?
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. To start though with the social media thing, I think we like to ignore some of our history and forget it because we're of course always centered in our present. Ayatollah Khomeini and his tapes, his little audio cassettes from Paris, for example. But we can even go back and the whole nature of the Russian offensive, if you will, in the 40s and the 50s in Europe particularly, but elsewhere. These were subversive activities, and they were agents of influence. So didn't need to have a transmitter. You just had to have a variety of other means. And I mean, what used to be in my presentations a long time ago was pointing out Paul Revere's carvings, right? The Boston Massacre. That is a heck of a piece of propaganda. There are so many bits of disinformation in that carving. It's crazy. On the flip side, there's the Declaration of Independence, which is a massive statement to a foreign audience, making the case why we're doing what we're doing. And of course, people forget how the bulk of that document is making the case why we need your support. This is why we're acting up. So there is a difference, but I've also written about and talked about in executive seminars actually on what I call now media, which is a difference between new media and old media. It was more about the effects rather than the platform. But to the point of chartered, yes. So you're talking about something different than what I've been talking about in my writings, because you're talking about the domestic side. And in fact, this is partly my argument, is that when people say bring back USIA, in fact, it was beginning of the argument, this conversation is that, hey, yeah, bring back USIA, you still leave out the United States, right? That is still excluded, not for the reasons you think, For example, the idea that it's an anti-propaganda, Smith-Munn is an anti-propaganda law is complete BS. And that is a manifestation of Senator Fulbright trying to kill USIA, trying to kill Voice of America, kill Radio Free Europe, kill Radio Liberty. That's what it was a manifestation of. And in fact, the idea that you're only supposed to be able to get information on request, which Fulbright changed even tighter and even prohibit you. And then Senator Zirinsky in '85 changed the language even more to cause a federal court to rule that USI material couldn't be accessed through Freedom of Information Act request, which is astounding when you consider that at about the same time and completely unrelated, Congress defanged the Foreign Agent Registration Act. So all of a sudden now, U.S. information operations for abroad, as truthful as they are now considered propaganda unfit for American consumption, and foreign media, foreign propaganda, whether innocent or not, is now no longer labeled as such, and it can come in freely. And these were completely unrelated, but almost identical moment in time. The idea of the you shall only request was actually a paperwork issue and an administrative issue by the original makers of the Smith-Munn Act, and we can talk about that. But it goes back into the domestic side that you're talking about. And this was seen as an internal security problem. And in fact, if you go back to the creation of the Committee for Public Information, the Secretary of War and the Secretary of Navy, and this is in my book that's not yet done, the Secretary of Navy and the Secretary of War were looking for a psychological defense entity. And that's why they established this central clearinghouse, this Bureau of Publicity, which was one of the initial names for it. Creel was brought in at the very last minute, actually. But this was an idea because there was a bunch of demand for information, which pretty much all the historians writing about CPI completely ignore. But there's this idea, and in World War II, we had a similar thing. The Office of Facts and Figures was created, and there was another entity which were merged in the Office of War Information. So you had these efforts, and yes, there is this distrust of how it works, and there was a partnership with the press. And so today, it is even harder because of the partisanship, but I don't see... I'm almost at a loss to even suggest something because I don't see there is an interest on any real leadership level to do anything. But this would be in general, I hate to use the term because it implies the department, but a homeland security issue. It's a domestic front. I would dispute the point that the State Department doesn't have the role here. I would say it should not have the primary role here because the Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs position was purposely established in December 1944 to inform the American public about what the heck the United States government was doing abroad. And in fact, there were instances where it did activities domestically besides the exchanges, besides all sorts of other things. But in the 60s, for example, the State Department was going up and down outside of DC, the highways, and saying, you need to let the African diplomats not be here. You need to stop harassing the African diplomats. They need to be able to come into the restaurants and all that. And it's obvious why they were doing that, but that's a domestic thing. But no, they shouldn't be on the forefront, but they should be speaking up. They can be on some of these issues. The other areas, I would say the intelligence community should be a monitor. They shouldn't be a speaker for not just functional reasons, but I think the legitimacy of the speaker and does that portray, and is that an American thing? DOD, obviously the same. My master's thesis opened up and it became a book chapter later. American public diplomacy wears combat boots. That was the opening line, which is a problem in itself. Should DOD be speaking? No, it should not. It should not be the lead as much as it is. Who else is there? I don't know. Partly the White House, partly others. One thing that's interesting, then I'll pause, is that Congress looked at this stuff in the past. And in fact, if you look at my War on the Rocks article, I forgot what was titled, it was the last one, but it talks about the Freedom Academy. The idea that we need to train our people, both people in government and civil society, on the tactics, techniques, and procedures of the adversary's political warfare. This wasn't a schoolhouse on how to conduct political warfare. This was an identification of what are they doing, so that as you go about everyday life or as a government person, design and implement foreign policy and programs, you know what they're going to do, what they might do, and you can be preemptive and even better reactive. That is something, but this type of stuff was taken up by the Judiciary Committee, because that's where the domestic security was taken up. Now, so conceivably, that would be the Homeland Security committees. They don't seem to care anything about these subjects as far as I haven't watched them, because they've never popped up. So, and of course, DHS is already a monster, so it doesn't seem like, and it's not particularly in their governance board was just terrible. The standing up, it was just an example of how we don't think these things through.
I think obviously the answer here is CISA. Like, they're taking over everything else. This is probably cyber adjacent. So clearly this is a CISA role, and they've got the money for it. So, let's get on with it. And they've got the mandate to do internal stuff. Like, come on. I think we can work this.
But I guess that raises the interesting question of where propaganda has shifted in the past 40 or so years with it. Does it make sense to focus mitigations and defenses in cyberspace, or is it something that needs still the holistic approach across a variety of different mediums? And would putting something like adding that as a mission to an agency like CISA be something they couldn't accomplish in the first place, but even if they were able to, would it end up only covering a small component of the broader problem?
So go ahead.
Yeah, what I would say with that real quick, and then I'll hand it over to Matt, is, DoD used to have this definition of information operations with these 5 pillars, right? And so part of those 5 pillars were, electronic warfare and PSYOP and computer network operations and operational security, electronic warfare, right? So there's a difference between the message content and how the message is delivered, and I don't think any one agency is capable of doing it on their own. The first thing. The second thing, I just want to answer real quickly a point that Matt made. I agree that right now there is no leadership appetite to address this. And I will tell you that Bruce Schneier wrote this great paper a few years ago about what different forms of government need to survive. And one of the things he said was that in order for democracy to survive, there has to be this common political knowledge. And part of that is we all have to, in a democracy, understand how our government works and believe that it actually works that way. We need to believe in the legitimacy of our leaders, and we need to believe in the legitimacy of our elections. And if information warfare, however you want to, whether it's PSYOP or any, however you want to label that, political warfare, if it attacks those foundations, that should be considered an act of war, right? Because the end effect is the same. And I'll hand it to Matt with that little bit of juicy softball.
Before act of war, I just say, I will buy that it's a national security issue, but act of war is pushing it.
I think if you saw the same, I think if the Russian attempted influence of the elections, whether you
Who wants to be the first person to die for a Facebook ad?
They wouldn't be the first person to die because of a Facebook ad.
Yeah.
No,
So
for a
it's,
Facebook, but yeah.
all right.
No.
Listen, if you don't think the U.S. government has whacked people for propagating, ISIS or other, Al Qaeda media out there, you're sadly mistaken. So,
Well, I would bring it to home, and I would point out the dude that went after the FBI office recently.
Oh, yeah.
That's, I think, more relevant. But so a couple of things here. One is on the act of war. So I think something that we forget about is that some of these actions can be, now these aren't the actions you're talking about, and this is not model, but just something to think about, is that some of these activities are in the eye of the beholder as to their seriousness. And let me explain that. So let's say we have a person who does elections go to France to talk about American elections. The French are going to say, whatever, okay, we'll listen. And that person goes to Beijing. The Chinese government is going to take offense, right? They're going to see that very same message as political warfare. In fact, when I was meeting with the number 2 of the state propaganda, the domestic propaganda agency, which is the more powerful agency, when I was a BBG governor, I said, VOA does very innocuous stuff. Like, we'll just talk about how an American registers to vote, right? Just very innocuous. Just like we'll talk about how an American pays a speeding ticket, right? Very innocuous, except to certain countries. What do you mean I don't hand cash of a variable amount to the police officer or who may or may not be a police officer, right? So obviously, but when I said about the election thing, don't lecture us how to run an election, right? They will see an innocuous, what we would do in another country as innocuous, they will rightly, I would argue, see it as political warfare. So some of these activities are in the eye of the beholder. This is why Russia and China, they have different views of how exchanges should work and what levels of exchanges. And exchanges, by the way, just to point out, aren't merely educational exchanges. They can be technical, bureaucratic, and in fact, the Smith-Munn Act was enabling a whole bunch of like let's get census takers, let's get waste management people, let's get agricultural experts, and those were highly influential people going abroad. And in fact, fun note: the original Munt bill was about high school teachers and training, exchanging them among the American countries, the American republics, because getting them young was important before even university, right? Anyway, so that's the active war part. Across the mediums and the how government work point. So there was a podcast, if I can refer to something else, the Crucible, the I should know the full name.
Sorry, we have a policy of not acknowledging that any other media exists.
Russ Burgos, I'll mention him. He just was on another pod that just dropped, I guess, this week. It was recorded 2 weeks ago. And he does a really terrific job of talking about the supply side and the focus on that, which he framed and phrased more eloquently than I have. And that is, we focus so much on they said something. In fact, I was writing something about this that I was going to push out, that somebody said something, so therefore, in Russ's terms, we need counter battery fire. And there's this, and that's inherently a reactive mindset. And that's a problem. And so what I think this conversation is exposing is that we are reactionary to the adversary's activities, right? We allow them to set the time, tempo, manner, method, place of engagement. And as I've said often, is that it seems that our policy in this regard is let's defend status quo ante, and ultimately we can restate our policy as stop it, right? Now, what's missing there is, why do these messages resonate? First, we need to interrogate whether they resonate, but then why do they resonate? And Pablo, as you got into, often civics, right? So how do we create the defenses? How do we inhibit their effectiveness, right? This Freedom Academy thing was aimed at inhibiting the effectiveness. In fact, that Freedom Academy thing, if you see the article, came up from this guy. He had been a World War II paratrooper, and he was teaching at Harvard, and he taught about, in the late 40s, he was teaching about the activities of this little-known insurgent named Mao Zedong. And then he went to Florida, and he was a lawyer, and then he realized nobody's learning about what the communist political warfare strategy is. So he creates this program in Orlando, Florida, and he has all these experts and these high school kids, because that's who he was teaching. High school kids, they were running a program, the high schools were inviting them in, knew more about Russian, primarily, secondarily Chinese, political warfare than anybody in the nation, except maybe some people in the intelligence community. And so that's what was the genesis of the Freedom Academy idea. But if you go back at the same time, you had a whole of society approach right? This is where "In God We Trust" gets inserted into the Pledge of Allegiance. This is where health and fitness, this is science, technology, not just, build highways, but you had a whole of society of, you need to know how your government works. You need to understand all these things. And part of the problem here is that we are seeking solutions to offload the responsibility from the target, right? These activities, not just messages, activities resonate for a reason, right? And part of it is civics. People don't understand how their government works. As I used to say to people that were the tinfoil hatters, you should hope that your conspiracy theory or story is right. Oh my God, why? Well, it means your government works, because if you actually worked in government, that's just simply not possible. And it would mean that your tax dollars are being used efficiently. And if you worked in government, that it would cost a lot to do what you think you're claiming happens.
I used to joke that I wish that the U.S. government were half as competent as Hollywood makes it seem when I was in the intelligence community. But I'm glad I'm not the only one that's that cynical.
I think, in the 21st century, that the tinfoil hat wearing conspiracy theory folks have basically replaced like religious fervor, right? We really want order. We want the existence of order in some way, to the point that we're willing to believe that the government works and can get stuff done, and can manage in these ways. So the whole information side of this is sort of, it's fascinating. It feels a little out of my realm, but something that we've been discussing around that, because we talk a lot about sort of disinformation operations and how different countries have gone about them, and why the U.S. doesn't seem to be very effective at them, at least anymore. Do you feel like scope is enough of an issue to essentially make it impossible for us to run any of our own information operations at this point? Like you mentioned, sort of shortwave radio, right? It was expensive. You needed to be a nation state to really afford it, and you would direct it in a certain range, and you would be affecting a particular population. In this day and age, I think discussing the fallout that an information operation would have when you put it on the internet and it essentially percolates down to hundreds of thousands of millions of people in an uncontrolled manner seems to efface any ability we have to get out of our own sort of paper bag of, hey, we need to control what the effects are going to be of what we're doing, in a way that I think wasn't an issue in the 40s, 50s, 60s, where it was actually really hard to reach a massive population, and you were just hoping that the message would get across.
So, yeah, I think there's some salient issues in that. So first, the fallout issue, and I think that you're partially referring to this recent DoD, maybe CENTCOM, and the contractors doing these interesting programs.
Right.
Embarrassing. I think
Which,
is the word.
yeah, and so, and this gets into, and this also relates back to a decade, 2 decades ago, when the complaint in the IO community or the military community was, the bad guys get to lie. We don't get to lie. Well, I'm sorry, but do we need to lie? And I think this gets into, and the complaint of, that relates to the complaint of asymmetrical warfare. I'm sorry. Why do you want to fight symmetrically? Everything is asymmetrically, right? Anyway, it just confounded me. But I think this goes back to the problem of the policy and the fact that we feel like we need to put lipstick on the pig. We need to change the subject. We need an information program to compensate for the lack of a strategy or a confusing strategy. There's a compensation effect that's going on here. It's not a clear cut, what are we doing and why? And this goes back to the leadership issue. And do we prioritize this? Which, again, goes to your question. I don't think we do. I think we did. So to the point of, for example, shortwave. So VOA, for example, had a radio set up. I don't know if they still have any part of this, actually, in was it North Carolina? I hope it's not South Carolina. I think it was Greenville, North Carolina. And this was massive. There was a massive field of transmitters over here, site A. There was another massive transmitter field over here called site B. And there was a command and control complex, site C. I think I had A, B, and C correctly on that one, but you get the point. Okay, you know why A and B existed? They were redundant because this was the importance of this. And why was this command center separate? Because what if one was bombed? This is how important this was. Now, this cost a massive amount of money, and that's just this one site, right? And there were plenty of other transmitters around here. But we don't have the same prioritization. And that's not to say that we had an unlimited prioritization then, because there were constant complaints that we were underfunding. If we only, the cost of less than the cost of a battleship was the argument in 1946 and 1947, we can have this massive information operation, which we absolutely need because the Russians are increasing the tenor and tempo and volume of their disinformation campaign. Plus you had misinformation and you had the lack of information, but you had this prioritization. But as we see, there was a degradation of the prioritization. You had a marginalization of the information. And I would argue that it's readily apparent that over these last several decades, the relevance of information to policy is de minimis and or low, I think is better phrasing. And you see that with funding. Where does the money go? You see this with leadership, the complete absence of leadership. And you see this in the really tactical reactions to try to compensate for the lack of policy. I don't want to use the word strategy because I feel like I'm overreaching, because of course there's no real strategy, right? So if you want to compare to the 1940s and 1960s, those are the stark differences. And I would argue it started to die in the 1950s as détente started to approach, as the walls became firm, literally, in Europe, and we started to further, hey, you know what, this antagonism doesn't work, let's do this, let's do that. So, but there was leadership for this, and there's not today.
Let me hit you with a radical idea, just because what you've brought us is in so many ways not just fascinating, but surprising in how different it is to how we have approached a lot of these topics. And I think in one of the most seminal ways is that you've been talking about the importance of disseminating or amplifying truthful information, right? Like, we don't necessarily need to lie. We don't necessarily need these like insane narratives and this game of active measures that the Russians are so fond of and so good at. But really, like, you know, like Silas and I have talked a lot about this sort of projects in South and North Korea, where people will just drop movies and different aspects of, you know, just Western culture for the sake of, hey, look at how the rest of the world lives. And that's enough, right? You're showing them that, you know, people aren't starving, they aren't having quite as horrible a time. And that depiction in and of itself is valuable. I'm curious if you can see any form of packaging that makes just a model of amplifying accurate information in this day and age that can possibly withstand the stickiness of the other side of things, right? The disinformation, the QAnonness, the conspiracy theory, the deep state, everything is misaligned in this, that way, and the other. I guess I'm coming at, how do you build narratives rooted in reality that are appealing in the way that everything else in some conspiratorial fashion seems to take a life of its own? And I don't expect you to have an answer per se, but, you know, it is sort of
Actually,
like a salient
we do
question.
expect you to have an answer. This is you're on the clock.
Yeah,
I'm glad 6 minutes to fix this.
Because I don't have an answer, because part of the problem that we have today that we didn't before is that the call is coming from inside the house. Is that this isn't a question of, hey, who are we? Which I think gets too metaphysical to matter and really is missing the point. but that there are too many actors that don't want to deal with, too many leadership actors that don't want this fixed, that they benefit from it. And this is a real problem. And some of this goes down, you can chalk it up to partisanship, because, for example, in the 40s, 50s, 60s, you still had parties. You still had Republicans and Democrats and a few independents, but they managed to agree on threats to U.S. national security and viability, and they saw and they agreed and they discussed. The 80th Congress was the Do-Nothing Congress, as labeled by Truman. The Smith-Mundt Act was passed in the 80th Congress. It was a Republican bill. It was not passed in the 79th Congress because the Republican leadership in the Senate thought it was a Democrat bill, because the Democrat chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee took it away from Mundt, who was a Republican, who was put on the committee to interfere with Truman's agenda, by the way. But point is, they still all got together and they still agreed this is a critical issue. And they managed to do this. We don't have anything like that that's going on today. And so, even with civics education, if that's challenged when you have people pretending that teachers have more power than they actually do to indoctrinate students, and so pull them out of school. So, yeah, that's an interesting point. And as far as the Russians are good at active measures, I think sometimes we inflate them up to be the boogeyman. I think one of the things that we miss is that the nature of their lack of culpability means that they get to try various things at once. And this goes back to an earlier comment. I forgot who said this. My analogy with information activity and our reticence around it, I would equate to gas warfare and the fact that the civilized nations outlawed it in the 1899 Hague Convention against other civilized nations. Now, it hadn't really been used yet, but it's because it contaminated the battle space. You couldn't control it. It could come back on your people. Same idea with information. I'm terrified. I'm afraid of it. I don't know. I have to control it. I can't control it. I'm going to leave it alone.
That's a wonderful analogy, because gas turned out so well. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think they've
we're
overcompensated.
basically out of time. Sorry.
Yeah, perfect.
No, it has been absolutely wonderful having you on. This has been a fascinating conversation. We'd love to have you back to keep going, particularly to talk about how we can use our information phosphine across the trenches of the cybers. I believe that's where you were going with that analogy.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah.
That fits in with the truth.
Right.
Bombs, right?
Truth bombs, right? Cyberchlorine. Okay, so we are out of time, and thank you very much to Matt Armstrong for coming on. We'd like to thank Kim Zetter for sponsoring, as always, Kim Zetter's newsletter, the Ridge Wallet, and VPN de Nord that you may have heard of, along with Team Thunting, I've been told. So congratulations.
Couldn't even pull that off.
Fronting.
Couldn't even. There you go. No,
You misspelled it. I mean, what can I do? Okay.
Matt, I mean, honestly, a lot of credit to you. This has been fascinating, and I think it if anything, our silence speaks volumes, right? Like this is usually just a game of like yelling talking heads over each other. So the fact that we could actually sit back and like just listen to you give an authoritative take on this, it's really appreciated. It's been fantastic. So I hope you'll jump back in at some point.
I'd love to. Thanks for the invite. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. This was great. This was fun.
Thanks very much for joining us. All right. Bye, everyone. Remember to subscribe and like and comments, notifications. We're trying to get Matt a job as an influencer, so your help with the algorithm, it's going to the right place.
Not taking it.
There you go. Take care, guys. Thank you.